Mascot platformers were at the height of their popularity in the early 90s, with games on various consoles featuring a whole rainbow of super furry animals saving the world from destruction. In 1994, Epic Megagames added to the fluffy army with their own lagomorphic hero, Jackrabbit. He was created by Cliff Bleszinski and was brought to life in a game thanks to the work of cartoonist Nick Stadler and the game engine talents of a demo scene coder who within a small margin of error is called Arjen Bruget. As usual in these adventures, it's up to Jazz to rescue Eva Earlong, the rabbit princess, from the clutches of an evil turtle called Devon, thus saving his home planet Caritas. He does this by bouncing his way maniacally through a variety of environments, blasting turtles and other enemies with his multi-purpose gun, and collecting all kinds of junk lying around the levels for the sake of score and power-ups. The objective of each level is to find the sign with his arch-enemy's face on it and swap it out with one of his own, less like saving the planet and more like he's going around replacing their front lawn signs to influence a school board election. In the best of platformer traditions, the game is split up into different themed worlds. They have names like Nippius, Scrap-a-Rap and Tech Noir, which was named after the company of Stay Cork who had written the earlier epic title Overkill. Each of the game's episodes comprises 3 worlds of 2 levels each, an underwhelming boss monster called the Guardian at the end, and 1 or more secret optional levels on top of that. Graphically, the game is extremely bright and colourful. The cartoonish visuals suit the game perfectly, and Arjen's demo scene engine talents allow things to keep moving around with colour cycling and other special effects at a constant improbable frame rate. He also changes screen modes like they're going out of fashion, making it a bit of an effort to record and piece this game together into a video. The menus and the interstitial animations run in a standard VGA screen mode, but the actual game uses a unique 320 by 199 letterbox format with a different refresh rate. I was delighted to receive a Twitter response from Arjen himself about why the game used 199 lines, although the answer was that he couldn't remember. The most obvious graphical inspiration comes from Sonic the Hedgehog, and you can see a lot of borrowing from places like the Chemical Plant Zone in the pipes that transport Jazz around the Tube Electric level. But the run-and-gun gameplay was mostly inspired by Amiga platformers like Zool and Turrican. Jazz does get a Sonic-like running shoes power-up to enhance his already twitchy speed, but the levels aren't really built to take advantage of it except in very specific areas. You have a fairly limited number of hit points that varies depending on the difficulty you select, from the easy baby bunny to the steroid-addled abomination that represents the Ultra mode, and even though the game's speed makes it tempting to ricochet around with a total disregard for everything, learning to take things slowly is tremendously to your advantage. The platforming gameplay is made up of fairly routine jumping and shooting, but it gets broken up by some special sequences. For example, some levels have this hoverboard available to allow Jazz to reach heights he couldn't normally. The bonus stages between levels use a Mode 7 style trick to display a 3D racetrack in a very similar way to Sonic CD, which was released the previous year, and throughout the game you can discover secret levels where you play as different characters, such as a bird that's usually only available as a sidekick to Jazz. There are also a couple of non-platforming water levels, which everyone loves. It's also worth mentioning the great music that accompanies all of this, once again rendered in PSM mod format by Robert A. Allen, and very reminiscent of his soundtrack for Epic Pinball. It's amazing how much he could do with just 4 channels to work with. Similar to Epic Pinball, Jazz has a frankly preposterous number of episodes spread across multiple different releases. Originally, 6 of them were available, purchasable in 2 packs of episodes 1 to 3 and 4 to 6. Towards the end of 1994, a CD version of the game was released containing all of these, plus 3 more episodes, oddly labelled A, B and C instead of continuing the traditional numerical order. In December, a free winter-themed standalone episode called Holiday Hair was released, and was then bolted onto future CD and shareware versions as Episode X. Finally, an 11th episode called Holiday Hair 95 was released the next year, but was never included as part of any version of the main game. Amazingly, despite the vast length of the adventure, every world has its own unique set of graphics, meaning that the complete collection has 30 different tile sets. This definitely puts Jackrabbit ahead of Apogee's side-scrolling release from 1994 Hocus Pocus, for example, which reused several of its environments across its 16 worlds. Speaking of Apogee, the earliest shareware version of Jackrabbit included the word Apogee as a cheat code, with the result of reducing the game's frame rate and limiting it to a 16-colour palette in an effect called Apology Mode, making fun of their adherence to outdated EGA graphics. It was common for the two companies to poke at each other in their games by making references to each other's characters, but I feel this one seems a bit mean-spirited. It crossed the line from Apogee's point of view as well, and so the cheat code was removed in all later versions. I was always quite drawn to jazz despite the short length of the shareware episode, and not just due to being a massive unawakened furry. Despite the number of platformers that had come before it in the shareware market, it was a noticeable step forward in achieving a console-style feel, and it had the right combination of variety and polish to become the company's best-selling game of the time. Epic certainly knew they had something special here and kept promoting it well beyond its release date with the incredible number of episodes that were later bolted on. In their newsletter from November 1994, they declared him America's favourite rabbit, which makes sense given that he barges into places he doesn't belong carrying a large gun, and the game was praised in magazines everywhere as a worthy rival to commercial releases. The sum total of Jazz Jackrabbit's 11 episodes are available on GOG.com for $10 at the time I'm putting this video together, under the name Jazz Jackrabbit Collection. This gets you the CD version and Holiday Hair 95, along with a DOSBox-based wrapper to run it. There is also an open source remake of the game by Alistair Thompson called Open Jazz, and it's available at the author's site at alistair.eu. It was written starting in 2005 and has been gradually updated ever since, bringing the game to Windows as well as more diverse platforms like Android, the Dreamcast, and even the Canoe, which is an open source handheld device from South Korea. It recreates the game impressively well considering he didn't have access to the original source code, and it allows you a few more options on top of the base game. Not least of these is the opportunity to increase the size of the game window, which helps a lot with your ability to go at high speeds without running face first into turtles and spikes. As if that wasn't enough, this version also supports several multiplayer modes, along with the option to swap out Jazz's colour palette in case you want to play as your own persona. Open Jazz works with some, less, all or more of the episode files from the original game. All that's needed is to drop its files into the folder of whatever version of Jazz you have, and then to run the Open Jazz exe file instead. 1994 marked the arrival of a new face as well. Safari Software had been founded in 1989 and had released a couple of small shareware titles before partnering with Epic and eventually becoming a division of them. One of the earliest games they released together was Highway Hunter, an unusual take on a vertically scrolling shoot-'em-up which was developed by a 4-person team from Russia called Omega Integral Systems. This group had previously released several shareware titles that were primarily distributed in Russia, and Highway Hunter is an updated version of one of their previous games called Highway Fighter. If any of them worked on subsequent games, I sadly haven't been able to find any information on them, although the programmer Alexander Safonov is now a reputed underwater photographer. Highway Hunter's storyline doesn't really come into the picture whatsoever, but just in case you want to know, the schizophrenically named Axis of Allied Planets have taken over Earth and they're now terraforming it to make the environment more suited to them, with the side effect of slowly exterminating all human life. The player, who is a prisoner in one of their facilities, is tasked with designing a vehicle called the Master to help destroy the remaining resistance. Naturally, as soon as the Master is complete, he swipes it and makes a break through the prison's security belt in a bid to reunite with the humans. In gameplay terms, this results in you piloting your battle car through a constantly scrolling game field on the highway above the city, collecting power-ups and using your weapons to fend off anyone who gets in your way. Unlike other shooters, your movement area is limited to the road surface and you have to weave from left to right as it does to avoid taking damage. It plays uncannily like an advanced version of everyone's first game they made in Quick Basic, where you have to nudge your ASCII car left or right to avoid falling off the road as it scrolls. There are an impressive number of different environments to fight your way through, each with different enemies, and also some nice multi-layered parallax scrolling effects that form the backdrop to the game. My first impression of Highway Hunter wasn't very favourable because at first it seemed utterly overwhelming and I could barely get anywhere before my car utterly fell apart and I got the game over message. But when I went back to it for a second set of attempts, I found myself beginning to understand what the game wanted from me. Apparently, the game's difficulty was significantly toned down from the original Highway Fighter incarnation, and if that's true then I dread to see what the original was like. But even though it's a very demanding game, after a few attempts you begin to recognise the patterns and how to survive a bit longer. Most of the lessons involve learning how to most effectively use the various weapons and shields that are dropped by enemies. There are various different defense mechanisms to protect the sides, front or other areas of your ship, and only one can be active at a time. Paying attention to incoming enemy fire and learning to dodge it is extremely important, especially when it's from enemies off the side of the road that you can't hurt, such as these giant cannons that launch basketballs at you from the ground. You also come to realise that the weapons you're picking up are limited by ammunition rather than time, and that they revert to the next level down when they run out. Therefore, you have to be conscious of taking your thumb off the fire button now and then, so you're not wasting your precious high-level weapons by shooting them off into nothing. Each level concludes with a large boss ship or vehicle, which has sometimes popped up throughout the level beforehand to annoy you before finally becoming destructible at the end. A lot of these are very creative and interesting, but they have a theme of having far too many hit points, turning fighting them into a slog of an endurance match. This is particularly noticeable when you find a flaw in an enemy's shooting pattern which lets you sit still and fire on their weak spot, and it can still take a year and a half for it to finally explode. As you'll be used to by now, the game contains 3 episodes, and the first one was available as shareware. However, less usually, the game is played continuously from start to finish, with your weapons and score carrying over between episodes. The second and third boxes on the menu where you start the game act more like skipping to checkpoints. Each episode is made up of 5 levels that take 3 or 4 minutes each. Highway Hunter is quite a lot like the earlier Epic title Overkill in being a tough short game that rewards you for your efforts in getting better at it. I would estimate that you could complete the whole thing in an hour from start to finish if you do it perfectly, but you're very unlikely to do that without a lot of practice. Strangely, the first episode seems significantly harder than the others. I had a lot of trouble getting past the early stages of episode 1, but went right through episode 2 without using any continues at all, but this could just be due to me getting more used to the game as I went on. I've been unable to find anywhere to legitimately get the full version of Highway Hunter, but the shareware version is around on the usual places such as RGB Classic Games. Traffic Department is possibly the most boring name for a game that has ever been conceived, and I say that as a massive fan of Transport Tycoon. But by sticking the year 2192 on the end, Epic suddenly revealed the potential for some excitement in the second driving theme game that they released in 1994. The titular Traffic Department is the one based in Vault Haven, which is one of the main cities on the desert planet Sesh. As the city has been under attack from a cult army called the Vultures for 25 years, the department has somewhat evolved from its original purpose of regulating the city's hoverskid traffic, and is now relied upon as the defending force fighting against the dictatorship. John Pallet Plowright made a return here as the director of the game, having upgraded himself from his artist position in earlier games and leading a group called P-Squared Software. The game was published by Safari Software again, with Epic as the distributor in most of the world. Interestingly, John's brother Michael, who is also credited in the game, wrote a game in the early days of ZZT called Quest for the Golden Tiara, but I haven't been able to find a release date for it, so I'm not sure if that game is how Tim Sweeney originally got in touch with the two of them. As usual, most of the music was provided by Robert A. Allen, but this time there was some assistance from John and Michael as well, and the soundtrack is very reminiscent of Dan Froehlich's sound for early Epic games, especially the music from Solar Winds. Traffic Department is a top-down free-roaming shooter where you scoot about a city completing short missions that are transmitted to you through your onboard computer. These missions vary from blowing up some enemy ships to blowing up some more enemy ships, and occasionally protecting something while blowing up even more enemy ships. Your controls are very simple, offering the use of 8 directions with the arrow keys, your ship's cannons or missiles on space, and a couple of other controls for afterburners and reading messages, which are placed rather unfortunately at the opposite end of the keyboard from everything else. In an odd way, the game is reminiscent of the first Grand Theft Auto, with you being pointed towards an area of the city with the navigation arrow that hovers around you, and expected to fly yourself there and deal with whatever's there by any means necessary. The game has a continuous and impressively thorough storyline written by Chris Perkins, who is now the senior story designer for the Dungeons & Dragons games. The plot is laid out via a slideshow of character portraits at the outset and conclusion of each mission, and there are an impressive number of full-screen 3D rendered stills of the locations to set the scene. The player character is one of the department's pilots called Lieutenant Velasquez, who is meant to be all badass and edgy but instead comes across as thoroughly dislikable. To be fair, she did have to live through a vulture attack in which her father was killed several years before the story begins, and that justifies being slightly bitter, but her disregard for orders and constant lashing out both verbally and physically at her commanding officer, peers and anyone else in the vicinity would more usually earn her a trip from the traffic department to the HR department. Apart from when she knocks out someone who needs an escort and refers to her as sugar tits, where the violence is entirely justified. This is something else that's new for Epic's catalogue, and it really sticks out after all the previous titles. It's the first of their games to contain dialogue with a lot of strong language. Admittedly, this is from a time when saying the word crap in a game was quite shocking, but it's one small example of PC games of the time trying to shake their child-friendly reputation and grow up a bit. To be honest, it didn't often work, and such games often read like they were child-friendly games who had missed their nap and were testing their boundaries, but it's interesting to look back and see the difference. The game provides an option on startup as to whether you want to use the original dialogue or a softened-up version where a lot of the cursing is replaced with the futuristic swear word "reox", and even comes with instructions in the readme for deleting the choice entirely if you want to hand the game to your 10-year-old. It's an interesting touch and one that I can't remember seeing in many other DOS games. If the game has a main weakness, it's how repetitive it is. The missions that you're sent on don't have a lot of variety, with your objectives being limited to destroying the thing your arrow is pointing at if it's red, or escorting the thing your arrow is pointing at if it's green. Usually, things you're supposed to escort get miles ahead of you, but can fortunately manage very well without your assistance. Disappointingly, the second episode also uses the exact same map as the first one. The third one gives you a completely new map, but unfortunately it's much less interesting than the one available as shareware, being just a grid of roadways suspended above a nondescript ocean. I also found it fairly awkward to control, although I sort of got used to it as the game went on. The ship doesn't quite have the momentum you'd expect, and it's very hard to manoeuvre with any degree of strategy when you're in combat. There's an oddity where if you switch from going one direction to the other instantly, you'll throw the ship into reverse instead of turning around. This is actually very useful for when you want to keep firing when retreating, but you have to remember that you have to go in a little half circle if you really want to turn around. The view is also too zoomed in for the speed you're usually going, and I find myself mostly squinting at the tiny minimap in the bottom centre to get a better idea of the presence of any buildings I was about to crash into. One last note is that after having a couple of pieces of his background music featured in this game at the age of 13, Michael Pallet Plowright now writes and performs music variously under the names Owen Pallet and Final Fantasy, and he's done a large amount of orchestral work for other artists' productions including Robbie Williams and Taylor Swift. He and Will Butler were also nominated for an Academy Award for their soundtrack for the film Her in 2013. Traffic Department was released as freeware in 2007 and can be downloaded from RGB Classic Games at classicdosgames.com. I didn't grow up with this one, and I've got to say I wasn't totally captivated by it, but to be honest, being the worst Epic game in a year like 1994 isn't saying much, especially when titles like this next one were coming out. While Jazz Jackrabbit was a new entry to a crowded field of shareware platform games, Epic's other most famous release from 1994 was for a genre that was underrepresented to the point of being completely absent on the PC at the time. One Must Fall 2097 was their answer to Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, and the rest of the crowd of one-on-one fighting games that were wrestling for supremacy on the consoles of the early 90s. One Must Fall centres itself around the indisputably magnificent concept of two building-sized robots beating the hell out of each other, and on its own merits in pulling that concept off, as well as having very little competition to speak of, it remains one of Epic's most recognisable games. It was primarily written by brothers Rob and Ryan Elam, and shockingly it was the first complete game they had ever published. The game originated as a much more straightforward competitor to Street Fighter II than in its eventual form, as we can see from this early version of the game, which was distributed around the shareware libraries in 1993. This was a very limited prototype featuring two karate fighting people, having a leisurely bout in front of a nice sunset. Interestingly, the move to the final game's robots was largely inspired simply by convenience, because it was much easier to model and animate a collection of angular robotic characters than it was to draw all the sprites needed for passable-looking humans. Therefore, the One Must Fall prototype got the number 2097 appended to it and evolved into a futuristic setting where the entire world economy is dominated by the World Aeronautics and Robotics Megacorporation, or WAR for short. The company began in the distant future of the year 2009 as a startup that researched and built human-assisted robots for space travel. These HARs are vessels that humans can be linked to via their brains, effectively uploading their consciousness temporarily into the robot and being able to control it as if it were their own body while being immune to any danger the robot might be in. WAR now provides these HARs to all governments and companies of the world for defence, security and transportation to the 4 extraterrestrial human colonies in the solar system. As the game begins, a 5th colony is being set up on Ganymede, and a representative from WAR is to be chosen to lead it. The company has chosen not to go down the usual boring route of meritocracy, corporate bribery and nepotism, but instead to have the frontrunners knock the stuffing out of each other while safely behind the neural link to a HAR. A fighting tournament between these giant robots is to be set up as publicity for the strength and power of the next generation of war machines, and the player assumes the role of one of the human operators, who are known as pilots. The split between pilots and the actual robot that they fight with gives One Must Fall an extra bit of depth to its character selection right off the bat, where statistics and movesets can be mixed and matched with each other. The 10 fighters available in the traditional one-player fighting game mode all have their own levels of power, agility and endurance, which translate to the amount of damage you do, the speed of your robot and how much of a beating you can take before falling over. They also have their own intertwining stories and reasons for wanting to get the Ganymede position, some for access to war's secrets, some for fame for themselves. After selecting a pilot, which sets your statistics and colour scheme, you then pair them with a HAR or robot body. The robots have a variety of interesting designs, with most of them being reasonably human-like but also featuring the occasional elephant skull on wheels with a pair of flails attached. Only 2 attack buttons are available representing the robot's punches and kicks, or alternatively flails and tusks, and they can be modified by holding direction keys along with them. Generally, holding forward will result in a light, quick attack, and holding back will give you a stronger, heavier one. Each robot also has its own set of a few special moves, which can be activated with the usual combinations of double taps and quarter circles, and a stun bar which will cause them to freeze if they suffer a rapid set of attacks in quick succession. So, after choosing a pilot and then a robot to go along with them, everything goes pretty much as you'd expect from a fighting game. You and your opponent are set up facing each other in a single screen-sized arena, and your objective is to batter their health bar down to 0 before they do the same to you. The selection of arenas is fairly limited compared to other fighting games of the time, featuring only 5 of them and not even featuring any special ones for the final bosses, but depending on the location where you fight, various different obstacles come into play to vary the gameplay a bit. In the power plant arena, made famous by the shareware version of the game, knocking an opponent into walls will cause their robot to execute the zap command and will throw them further away than normal. The fire pit features a floating sphere that will release a fireball under your opponent when you connect with it, and the desert features some annoying fighter planes that come at you in various formations from the background and deplete your stun bar. In a nice touch, after each fight, the game will transition to a very anime-styled sports reporter who gives one of several scripted reactions based on whether you won or lost and how much health the winner had left over, commenting on the closeness or the lopsidedness of the fight. And once you've beaten up the rest of the cast, along with the unplayable boss character in the one-player mode, you're given a piece of story telling you the triumphant or disastrous aftermath of your chosen pilot's ascendance to power. That would honestly be about all you'd expect from a normal mid-90s fighting game, but One Must Fall has a whole second layer to it in the form of the tournament mode, understatedly presented as a third option on the main menu. When I first picked this, after discovering the game when I was 10, I was expecting it to just be a way of staging an 8 or 16 player knockout tournament, but was astonished when I was instead presented with an entirely new game. This mode takes place after the giant robot fights have served their original purpose and have now been set up as an entertainment sport, with you entering as an inexperienced pilot who has the ambition of climbing to the top of the big leagues. You begin with a small loan of $500,000 and participate in ladder matches against the other characters from the main game plus some new ones who are exclusive to the tournaments. In these fights, the points you earn translate directly into cash, so you'll earn more if you get long combination attacks or you keep your health bar high. After each match, you're awarded your score in cash, plus the fight's prize money if you win, and minus your repair costs. Then you're given a talking to by your perpetually disgruntled chief mechanic, and you're moved up a position if you won or down if you lost. Then you're free to spend your earnings on upgrades for your robot or training courses for your pilot, therefore increasing your chances of success the next time around. If you keep losing money, your mechanic will tell you he's being forced to sell parts to cover the repair cost, and will eventually kick you out if you fail to repay your debts. The tournament mode is an unexpected gem that really extends the lifetime of the game. It has a very different feel from playing through the standard arcade style mode. The fights tend to be longer than before because you begin with very low level robots, but as you climb the ranks and fill up your stat bars, things gradually get a lot faster and more challenging. As if all of the above wasn't enough, One Must Fall also has a healthy stack of secrets buried beneath the surface. One of these is the existence of finishing moves, as infamously popularised by Mortal Kombat in 1992. Here they're split into 2 stages called Scrap and Destruction moves. Each robot has a hidden button combination that you can enter as the "You Win" graphic comes up to give your opponent an extra beating, and then another combination on top of that to completely obliterate them. Performing these is worth a large number of points, so getting used to pulling them off consistently is well worth it, particularly in the tournament mode. If you use these in certain places during the one-player game and then use another hidden button combination, you get access to a couple of one-off hidden arenas where you fight the secret characters Fire and Ice. There are also a couple of things in the options that are strangely set to off by default, because it wasn't quite understood at this point that they would become staples of the fighting game genre. Some of them are even hidden as secrets in an advanced options menu that's accessible by holding down the keys 2097 at the same time on the main menu. Hyper Mode lets you perform some special moves from the air and gives you some control over projectiles, and Re-Hit Mode allows what we would now call juggling. When you knock an opponent into the air, you can continue landing hits on them as long as you don't use the same move twice. To be honest, I'm not extremely qualified to evaluate One Must Fall as a fighting game, as the simple fact is that I don't really know much about them. But I can say that the shareware version of this game absolutely captivated me and my siblings when I was younger, and we spent many rounds using its limited selection of robots and going endlessly through the one available tournament. We asked our parents for the full registered copy, but due to a slight miscommunication received Rise of the Robots 2 instead. There really was nothing else that came close to it on the PC when it was released, and it's fondly remembered by many people, an incredible achievement for a first full game project by a very small team. One Must Fall was made freeware in 1999 and can be downloaded from anywhere that comes up for the game's title in a Google search. Reloaded.org is the place I found that I trusted the most. On top of that, the Tournament compiler is also available for download. This is a tool that was used by the developers to create tournaments and the behaviour of their AI, but I haven't quite invested the time to fathom it out just yet. Alongside it is a utility that can import new character pictures into the game, again so that you can play as your own persona. In what's becoming a pattern, there is also an open-source remake of this game called OpenOMF. The team behind it has the primary aim of improving the networking code, because typically for DOS and early Windows games, the multiplayer option for OMF uses a network protocol called IPX for Inter-Network Packet Exchange, which was designed for local networks and isn't suitable for use over the modern internet. OpenOMF isn't in a playable state yet, but progress is slowly being made and you can keep up with development on OpenOMF.org. 1994 was a year of fewer games but bigger hits for Epic, and with projects like OpenJazz and OpenOMF happening, those titles will be kept alive for a long time yet to come.